Alright, time for another excursion in the Almost Aviation Twin Otter. And the more observant of you will have noticed I'm not actually in the Twin Otter at the moment. This is the default FSX Learjet. And in the interest of science, I've configured my cockpit to be able to fly this. And we're just lining up on a ILS approach to Snohomish County Airport in Washington State. Hopefully this is going to make some kind of sense in context as we go. But for now we're just getting airborne at Boeing Field, which is about 20 miles to the south in the Twin Otter. And we're going to look at how to hand fly the aircraft without recourse to autopilot. Now we've seen there's a lot of automation built into the Twin Otter, and it's although it's fairly basic by modern standards, it's pretty comprehensive, allows us to fly hands off in most situations and to navigate comfortably, taking a lot of the workload off our hands. I've just set it up on autopilot for the moment. Obviously it's going to be difficult to talk about this stuff and hand fly at the same time, so we'll leave it on autopilot for a moment. We're following just a simple flight plan I've got set up on the GPS. This is going to take us round the block and it's going to end up with us on that ILS approach. We're going to keep it low level. I've set up 1600 feet here as a ceiling because we've got a bit of weather around. So, hand flying the Twin Otter. There's a number of things we're going to be looking at. Most of them are connected to managing the power. These are very powerful engines, turboprop engines. I'm going to say more about what the consequences of that are in a little while. But there's a number of things that we need to keep an eye on in order to fly this thing precisely. And that's the key. I mean, it's easy enough to jump in this, get it up in the air, barge it around, you know, and even land it. But to fly it accurately and to put it where you want it, it's kind of tricky, and we're going to look at some of the reasons for that. Now the first thing we want to do is, in fact there's two sets of gauges we want to be keeping an eye on. If I just line them up here, you should be able to see those. The torque gauge gives us a direct readout of how much power we're commanding from the engines. And you notice there's a red line on this. We don't want to go over that red line, otherwise things will start to fall apart. Now the torque gauge, we're unlikely to over torque the engines on a mild day or a warm day even, because our limiting factor on a hot day is going to be into turbine temperatures. It's labelled on these gauges in this aircraft as T5, and that's going to top out long before the torque gauge tops out, and we do not want that to go into the red for more than a couple of seconds, otherwise something's going to, we'll very likely have an engine fire, certainly something's going to break. But on a cold day, or flying at high altitude or flying at night, we risk over-torquing the engine. So that was just an aside. But if we want an accurate readout of how much power the engines are producing, the torque gauge is what we want to look at. And what I've done is I've marked up my throttle quads with some approximate. The torques in this aircraft is read out in terms of percentage of maximum, and I think it is actually. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, the numbers on here match what's on the gauge. So I've got 5, 10, 20, 30, 35. And so if I position this at 20 on the quadrant, we get approximately 20 on the gauge. It's not a good idea to monitor those gauges too slavishly when making power adjustments, because they lag. So if I just illustrate that, I'm on about, so I'm showing about 35% on the torque gauges at the moment. If I go to 20 on my quad abruptly, and then watch the gauges, you're going to notice there's a huge drop below 20 there, and then the gauges will start to creep back up. Now presumably that's some feature of, you know, accurately models some feature of how a turboprop engine responds. But it means that we don't want to chase the needles when making power changes, because we'll get into trouble doing that. But by and large, these markings I've set on the quadrant, once things have settled down, they do match pretty well what's on the gauges. And these are independent of other parameters such as outside air temperature or nothing to do with the weight and balance. And what I've done is I've gone on and really established a set of kind of standard configurations. So I've noted, for example, when you fire up the Twin Otter extended in its default configuration, which is a full fuel load but no cargo or passengers, or 2 pilots only as cargo, setting a 20% torque gives me and on neutral trim, which is essentially takeoff trim, gives me a straight level cruise at about 110 knots. I mean, that's just interesting to know as a baseline. That's also, by the way, dependent on me having reduced prop RPM to about 90%. The torque readout will vary. Again, if I just pause this and you can watch the gauges. If I vary the prop pitch, I'm going to go to maximum. So you'll see the torque setting drops as the prop RPM rises. Or if I come down significantly on the prop RPM, which is actually increasing the prop pitch. Essentially what's happening is the prop's biting into the air. The props are getting more purchase on the air, and so the air resistance to the propellers is more. The torque generated, or the torque commanded from the engine, requires more to maintain that prop RPM. That's a very confused explanation, but hopefully you've got the gist of what I'm talking about there. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. That's the sort of thing you've got to work out by just experiment. You can see that we're flying that flight plan at the moment automatically on the Autopilot. Another thing just to note, when we're working this aircraft by hand, we've got the advantage of, if you look at the top of the pitch and turn panel, you've got a thing called a yaw damper. If I switch that on, that is essentially an auto-rudder function. So if I now want to make turns, I don't really need to bother about coordinating rudder and ailerons. That's done pretty much automatically. There's other reasons for having a yaw damper, but I'm not going to say any more about that here. I'm going to leave the yaw damper off for today because we're going to be looking at hand flying from the ground up. So the next thing I want to talk about is the effect of changing the power setting on the pitch of the aircraft or on the speed. If you've done any real flight training, you've probably heard the basic rule of thumb that we pitch for speed and we power for altitude. What that means is on a basic aircraft, training aircraft such as a Cessna 172 or 152, you can set a particular attitude using the elevator trim, and that as a consequence sets a particular speed, and that speed tends to remain fairly constant regardless of power changes. You'll get a momentary, if you increase the power, you might get a momentary pitch up, but once it settles down, you'll find that the aircraft is moving through the air at pretty much the same speed regardless of the rate of ascent or descent. And that's quite important because we want to maintain, I mean, there's particular stages of flight where we want to maintain a particular speed critically, such as the approach, but also in the cruise, we want to be able to plan for our flight planning for our en route speeds and so on. Now what we're going to find is in the Twin Otter it doesn't work that way. We get significant changes of pitch as a response to changes in the power settings. So we're going to look at that here and what we need to do to counter that. So let's just have a look at that. I'm going to take it off autopilot now. We're flying straight and level at 1700 feet, 125, 130 knots, and we're on about 30% power. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the power levers to maximum. We want to watch the attitude indicator, we want to watch the attitude visually, and we want to watch the speed. So here we go. Hands off, I should say, off the controls. I've put a bit of rudder in just to keep that roll out. You can see we get an immediate pitch down, the speed goes up significantly, and then if I do nothing else except I'm controlling the rudder, that pitch levels out and then starts to pitch up again. it is a bit bumpy up here, which is kind of masking the behaviour. You can see that speed's fallen off again. We're down to 130 knots. Well, it is gusting, and we're going into the cloud, which is not very helpful. And I'm going to roll off that power now, just because we don't want to over torque the engines. So I hope that was clear. On, you know, in fact, I'm going to keep climbing here so we get above the clouds. Okay, so we've climbed up above the clouds for the moment, just to give us a bit more leeway to experiment. But in a nutshell, what we saw there was, when we put in a significant increase in power, we get an immediate pitch down, the speed goes up dramatically. Then we get a dramatic pitch up, and the speed starts to come back. Then there's a period of oscillation, and it settles down, but it settles down to a net faster speed than we started at. And the converse is true, which we'll demonstrate now. So what I'm going to do is, we're at 25% on the torque. I'm going to come off autopilot. I was just on autopilot temporarily there. Straight and level. I'm going to go to idle. We're at 137 knots. Power to idle. We get a slight pitch up. It's difficult to see that at this, but the speed's dropped all the way to 117 knots. Then we get a major pitch down. Speed's going to start climbing again. (130 knots), 135. We're pitching back up again, and again we're going to go through a period of oscillation. But essentially, we're going to settle down to a significantly slower speed than we started at. That's a good way to actually explore that effect a little bit more rigorously, and we can use the autopilot to do that. So what I've done is I've set us to be cruising at about, or I will do, okay, we're doing about 120 knots. I've put in airspeed hold, and we'll let it settle down, and hopefully that's going to hold us at 120 knots. It's holding us at 115 knots, more 116 maybe, but that's okay. So what's going to happen now is we're at 20% on the torque gauges, more or less, and if I make abrupt power changes, the autopilot's going to trim to try and maintain that speed of about 116 knots. And so it's going to be instructive for us to watch the trim wheel while it does that. So there's the trim wheel. So what we want to do is we'll look at the starting speed, 116 knots. Then we're going to watch the trim wheel closely. So the trim's showing slightly forward of neutral, right on the edge of that central block. I'm going to put the power to maximum. We're going to get that immediate pitch down, which you can see the autopilot aggressively trims out by trimming nose up. Then it immediately stops doing that and goes back to neutral, and then it finesses that, and we're going to end up with a net change of trim, which is aft of where we started, to counter that new nose down tendency. And if we go back and look at the speed, you see it's holding pretty much, it's gone up a little bit on there, 117.5 maybe. We're going to be picky about it. It's essentially holding the same speed, but the trim's changed, and we saw that. I'm going to take that off in case we over-torque the engines. So that's the first experiment. Second experiment, again, if we let it settle down, we're on 35-ish trim there. It should be holding the speed again at 116, 117. Once again, if we concentrate on the trim wheel, the trims again is just towards the forward side of neutral. I'm going to go from 30-odd% to idle. You get an immediate pitch up, which is countered by the autopilot with an aggressive nose down trim. Then it recenters the trim and starts winding it somewhat forward of where it started. And if we go back and look at the airspeed, again we're on about 115. We've dropped a tiny bit on that airspeed. So I hope that made sense. That essentially tells us what we need to be doing manually to react to those pitch effects of changing the power settings. So if I come off autopilot and we're flying more or less straight and level, if I put in a massive or a significant increase in power, it wants to pitch down, so I've got to pull. I'm looking at the speed now, I've got to pull to counter that, and I'm watching the speed, not the pitch, don't forget. So we get a massive pitch up, then I've got to stop doing that because the speed's starting to drop. And then what I'm going to want to do to maintain that speed is do a little bit of nose up trim. And again, if I go power all the way off to idle, get a pitch up which I've got to counteract by pushing, watching the airspeed gauge there. And then when the speed settles down, I've got a net nose down attitude to maintain the speed, and I've got to put in a bit of forward trim to hold that. So that's how we can fly the aircraft manually and manage the pitching tendency that comes along with changing the power settings. Now, the reason we get those pitch changes is very light. I'm pretty sure it's because of the high wing design with the engine imagined on the wings. The engines are significantly above the centre of gravity of the aircraft, and so depending on the pitch, depending on the power setting, we've got a pitching moment, if you like, around that centre of gravity. It's most unfortunate on the approach, because the last thing we want is to be on full flaps doing 80 knots or 70 knots and then to be making assertive power changes to counter things like gusty weather or some other upset, and to get dramatic fluctuations in the speed. That's very dangerous, so we need to look out for that. Now, it's worth saying that this is going to be very different when we get the Iris force feedback yoke, and that's essentially what a force feedback yoke is going to be useful for. We're going to be able to sense those changes of pitch directly. When we make the power adjustments, the yoke's actually going to push against us or pull, and we're going to get a very good sense of what's happening to the trim of the aircraft and be able to counter it through feel using the pushing on the yoke and adjusting the trim with the trim wheel, just like we do in the real aircraft. So that's going to make a big difference to realism as we get force feedback on board. So where are we? We're a little bit north of where we need to be and a little bit higher, but we're going to go back onto autopilot, and we're going to get back onto the flight plan. Should take us onto that ILS approach, and we're going to look at another consequence of those turboprop engines on hand flying between Otter. So we're switching planes again, and this time we're in the BN2 Islander, and we're on the ILS approach again. We're just passing the outer marker. What we're going to do is take it off autopilot, and I'm going to basically throw in a bit of interference, just mix it up a little bit, and then I'm going to attempt to put it down on the numbers, absolutely as close as I can to the numbers by hand. Now, bearing in mind this is a similar class of aircraft to the Twin Otter. It's a sort of medium-sized cargo aircraft, twin engine, high wing, and the engines are mounted on the wing, but the difference is this has got conventional piston engines, and we're going to see what difference that makes. So we've got a little bit of weather going, but nothing too arduous. We might have a tiny bit of a crosswind from the right, but shouldn't be too bumpy, and we'll see how close we can get. So we're probably going to go to a bit of flap, for now. We'll get a pitch up, so we're going to put the nose down a bit. And again, this is a short takeoff and landing capable aircraft, so we should be quite easy to put it down where we need it to. It can land slow and short with full flaps. But what we're interested in here is how precise we can be in making power changes on that approach and what kind of response we get. So you see there we're not quite at idle, but the nose is dropping right off. And we're going to need a bit of power to come back in to pick that up. We're at about 70 knots, which is pretty much what we want for the Islander on the approach. So I'm setting that up with the trim wheel, and I'm seeing we're a bit high. We've still got the ILS guiding us in there. The radio's set up, and we're way above the glide slope. Of course, in a twin Otter or a Islander like this, we don't mind coming in a bit steeper than we would in an airliner or something like the Learjet. So there we go, we're coming in. We got good speed, that's the middle marker. And I'm just finessing it now on the power. And you see I'm getting fairly instant pickup on that power. It's allowing me to just adjust that descent rate very precisely. The last burst there, just to get us to the numbers, and we're going to be there. And that's pretty much on the numbers, a little bit past. Maybe a little bit of a hard landing. So that's the outer marker. We're going to come off autopilot. We've got the gear down, we're on flaps 2 notches, and we weren't quite established on the ILS, but I'm going to make my best efforts to put it on the numbers by hand. And bearing in mind I know very little about flying the Learjet, I know I should be aiming for about 140 knots approach speed. So I'm trying to come back a little bit on the speed. So we're pretty much there, 140 some. In fact, we're dipping below that, so we need to speed up a little bit. So what I'm finding is it's very difficult to get any assertive control over the engines. We're just about pulling up there. We're starting to balloon, so I need to come off. And again, that rolling off the throttle, it's having no effect, or no apparent immediate effect. We're going to go to full flaps. 180, my speed's gone right up again. That's the middle marker. So I've missed the numbers, but we'll see if we can get it down anyway. I guess that's the inner marker. So now we're coming down again, we're on idle on the throttles, and my speed's beginning to drop right off. I need to give it a bit more, but nothing's coming in, no power's feeding in. There's quite a large lag, and then there it comes, and you see once it comes in, we're into a balloon, so I'm not even going to hit the runway. Try to go around again. I've commanded pretty much full power there, just starting to come in now. So you can see that's a real problem. This is a turbine aircraft. We've got 2 very powerful jet engines on the back of this. No problem with the amount of power on tap. but the problem is commanding it. You know, it's like we've got a very long, sloppy chain of command from the power levers to the power plants. So we're setting up for that approach again, this time in the Twin Otter. And the reason we're doing this comparison is that the Twin Otter has a different kind of engines again. These are turboprop engines. Now, turboprop is essentially a jet engine, but the jet exhaust, instead of being used for propulsion directly, it drives a secondary turbine, and that in turn drives a propeller. And the reason that's useful is you get to retain some of the benefits of propeller drive, and most significantly the rapid response to changes in power settings. That's the theory. So what we're trying to establish is to what extent that's the practice. So I'm going to come out of the same deal here. I'm going to come off autopilot, just throw in a little bit of a interfering. I'm going way too fast here, so I'm just going to try and slow us down with this major interference, shall we say. Okay, well, that will let me get some flaps down. But same deal, we want to land on the numbers as close as possible, and we're going to see how easy it is to do that while making significant adjustments to power. So pretty high, but we've got plenty of space to adjust for that. I'm going to look for about 80 knots. I've got 2 notches of flaps down at the moment. I think I'll go to 3 notches. And again, remember, I'm going to be compensating for these pitch changes that we've already established as a characteristic of this aircraft. So when I go for an increase in power, the nose wants to go down, so I need to counter that by pulling back. And then we're getting something of a delay. Just listening to the engine note, you can already hear there's a delay between whacking the power in and it coming online, if you like. We can't tell how debilitating that is this far out, but there's definitely a lag there. It's also kind of difficult to manage that pitching without constant reference to the, look, see, now we're going too high there. I've really overcooked the power there. In fact, I'll go to full flaps. It is really difficult to judge those pitch changes as well, or more importantly, what the effect is on the speed without constant reference to the airspeed indicator. So I'm having to do that. So we're now on a fairly steady approach. I'm detecting I'm a bit high, so I'm rolling off on the power, but again there's no instantaneous change, so I've stayed too high, so I need to go right to idle there. I don't have any flaps left. Speed's good. See, we're dropping like a stone. I really want a little bit of power. What you've got to do is put the power in, not do anything drastic like pulling the nose up. Trust that power's going to come in. And there you see we've kind of thought we were going to make it, but we've really way overshot there, and we're carrying too much speed. You know, but and really there, if I was in the island, I would have given it a nudge of power at the last minute there, just to stop it landing too hard. But you know, in this again, we wouldn't get an instant. You can't really do that. You can't really blip the power in the flare and expect that it's going to do anything useful. Most likely, it's going to make you balloon and take you up again. So there you go. The real question is to what extent this is a reasonable and realistic simulation of a turboprop engine. Now, it's generally accepted that FSX doesn't do a very good model of the turboprop engine. The turboprop model in FSX is supposed to be based on the PT6 turboprop, which is the kind of engine that's fitted to this aircraft. But there's a general, as I say, consensus that it's not very well modelled, and that seems to be borne out in practice. There's, you know, there is a difference from flying a jet engine from this simple test, but you know, the main benefit of the turboprop, and I think the reason for its existence, is that it's supposed to allow you much more precise control of the power settings. And there is an interesting description of this in the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended Manual. The problem is that, although it's a detailed and interesting description, it seems to be a description of how it works in real life, not really how it works in the simulator. And so in practice it's actually quite a pain to fly this because of that lag, and it's the lag coming on or off the power, and it makes you, you know, you have to adopt a different style of flying really. You have to think further ahead, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. It's good airmanship really to plan and think ahead of the aircraft, making your power changes with finesse. But it does mean that if you're landing, particularly in gusty conditions, it's very difficult to be responsive to the aircraft. So, you know, maybe it's realistic. I've never flown a turboprop aircraft, so who's to say how realistic this is or not? But it's certainly difficult. You know, anyone who says this aircraft's easy to fly, you know, hasn't tried flying it enough, really, in my book. Either that or I'm missing something.